The world's most expensive doctors told the millionaire that his son was destined to be in a wheelchair forever. Devastated, he hired a simple cleaning lady to help with household care, with no hope of improvement. One day, he came home early, and the scene he saw made him panic. The cleaning lady was over his son, inserting needles into his legs that wouldn't move. The father went into shock, thinking the woman was torturing the boy, and rushed to stop her. But before he could scream, his son looked at him, smiled, and did the one thing all the specialists said was impossible. Arthur Sterling's empire was a symphony of perpetual motion. From his office atop the city's tallest skyscraper, he orchestrated the ebb and flow of a seemingly infinite capital. Screens flickered with stock tickers, profitability charts rose and fell like digital waves, and the constant ringing of phones was the melody of his growing fortune. His every decision, every order to buy or sell, moved millions of dollars in seconds, solidifying a net worth that most would consider the pinnacle of success. He was a master of the financial universe, a man whose life was defined by speed, anticipation, and the next big investment. But all that velocity, all that power, died at his own front door. In his mansion, a silent, austere palace in Westchester County, immobility reigned. It was there that his world, the only one that truly mattered, was paralyzed. His son, Leo, only 10 years old, was the motionless center of this universe of pain, a rare degenerative disease with a name as cruel as its effects was weakening his nerves, stealing his movement day by day. The boy's legs, which had once run through the estate's sprawling gardens, now lay inert under an Egyptian cotton sheet, prisoners of a body that had become a cage. The best specialists, the most world-renowned neurologists, had visited that house, flown in on private jets, examining Leo with their cutting-edge equipment and their bleak expressions. They all reached the same conclusion, a final sentence that echoed in the silent corridors. There was nothing to be done. The prognosis was a slow, progressive loss, and the wheelchair in the corner of the room was a constant reminder of the future that science had decreed. Arthur, a widower who already carried the weight of loss on his broad shoulders, now endured the agony of watching his son, the only light in his life, wither before his eyes. The head nurse, Agnes, a pragmatic middle-aged woman of almost robotic efficiency, administered the palliative treatments with a competence that left no room for illusions. To her, Leo was a case to be managed, a protocol to be followed. Hope, in her manual, was a side effect to be avoided. Into this environment of meticulously organized resignation, a new housekeeper was hired. Her name was May. She moved through the house with the lightness of a shadow, an immigrant with delicate features and a pair of eyes that seemed to carry the wisdom of generations. While Agnes saw a terminal clinical case, May saw something different. She saw the boy's vital energy, a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished, blocked by an invisible barrier. She observed the frustration in Leo's eyes when a toy fell to the floor, just out of his reach, the veiled sadness in Arthur's eyes when he told stories of games of catch they would never play again. The money, the immense wealth Arthur had accumulated, couldn't buy a cure, couldn't reverse the cruelty of fate. But May didn't see the world through the lens of capital or conventional medical science. She saw the flow of life, the balance of forces. And in Leo's silent room, she felt a profound imbalance, a broken harmony that called to her. One day, while cleaning the room, she noticed the boy's pale, motionless feet. Without thinking, following only an ancestral instinct, she stopped her work. Agnes was in the other room, organizing medications. Arthur had not yet returned from his empire of glass and steel. May approached the bed, her heart beating a soft, brave rhythm. She looked at Leo's sleeping face, an angel trapped in a body of stone, and knew she could no longer be just an observer. She had to try. With a gesture that was both a prayer and a silent act of rebellion, she touched the boy's foot. It was cold, almost lifeless, but under her palm, she felt a vibration, a tiny echo of energy, and in that touch, a bold and dangerous plan began to form in her mind, a plan that could cost her the job, but one her conscience demanded she follow. May's touch on Leo's foot lasted only an instant, but for her, it was enough to seal a silent pact. The next day, she arrived for work with a small cloth bag that did not contain her usual cleaning supplies. Inside, wrapped in silk, rested a small, dark glass bottle. She waited for the perfect opportunity, a rare moment when Agnes's vigilance was focused on cataloguing medical supplies and Arthur was deep in a teleconference about the Asian stock market, discussing the cash flow of a new multi-million-dollar investment. Money, with its universal language of numbers and power, filled the house with a cold, impersonal energy. Mei, on the other hand, carried an ancient warmth, a wisdom that couldn't be quoted on the stock exchange. She slipped into Leo's room and found him awake, staring at the ceiling with the resignation that had become part of his expression. A faint smile touched Mei's lips. She approached and, in a voice as soft as rustling leaves, asked, "May I?" Leo didn't answer with words, but his large, sad eyes gave a silent consent. With delicate hands, she opened the bottle. An exotic, comforting aroma of ginger and cinnamon filled the room's stagnant air. She poured a few drops of the oil into her palms, warmed it by rubbing her hands together, and began to massage the boy's feet. Her thumbs worked with a firm but gentle pressure, finding points that seemed to have been dormant for centuries. Leo sighed, a sound of pure relief he hadn't made in months. The rigidity in his shoulders eased, and for the first time in a long time, he closed his eyes not from exhaustion, but from comfort. It was at that exact moment that Agnes walked in. "What do you think you're doing?" Her voice was like the crack of a whip, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. Mei wasn't startled. She continued her rhythmic motion, looking up at the nurse with a calm that disarmed her for a second. "I'm just trying to ease the tension in his feet. Sometimes touch helps." Agnes let out a short, humorless laugh. "Touch, child. This is a degenerative neurological disease, not a sore muscle. Do you think a massage will cure what the best doctors in the world couldn't? Don't waste your time with this hocus-pocus and get back to your work. Mr. Sterling's fortune doesn't pay you to practice folk remedies." Mei didn't reply. She simply wiped the excess oil from Leo's feet, covered them with the sheet, and left silently. That night, something unprecedented happened. Arthur was in his study, reviewing his asset portfolio and trying not to think about how useless all that net worth seemed when he noticed the silence. Normally, the night was punctuated by Leo's involuntary spasms, small moans of pain that came through the baby monitor like daggers to his heart. But tonight, there was only the soft sound of his son's breathing. He slept the entire night, deeply, without a single spasm. The next morning, Arthur felt a spark of something he was afraid to nurture, hope. He didn't know the cause, but his son's peaceful night was a balm for his weary soul. Little did he know that, at that very moment, on the other side of the house, Mei was making a much riskier decision. The massage had been only the first step, a way to prepare the ground. Now, it was time to go deeper, to awaken the dormant energy. Tucked in her bag was another silk bundle. She brought it to Leo's room during Agnes's shift change, the only time she'd have a few minutes alone. With her heart pounding against her ribs, she knelt beside the sleeping boy's bed and unwrapped the fabric. In the soft morning light, a metallic glint shimmered. They were needles, thin and golden like slivers of sunlight. The golden needles seemed to absorb the dim light in the room, glinting with a silent promise. Mei's heart beat a dull drum against her ribs, a melody of fear and determination. She knew the risk she was taking. Being discovered wouldn't just mean losing her job, the only source of income that sustained her in this foreign country, but also humiliation, an accusation of quackery or worse. Agnes, with her blind devotion to protocols, would turn her in without hesitation. And Arthur, a man accustomed to the cold logic of numbers and the profitability of his investment funds, how would he react to an act that defied his entire understanding of the world? A man who measured success in dollars and euros would see no value in what couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. Yet, as she looked at Leo's serene face, May's doubt dissipated. She was not there as an employee, but as an heiress to an ancestral knowledge, a guardian of a wisdom passed from mother to daughter, whispered on starry nights and practiced in silence. This wasn't a job, it was a calling. With the reverence of one performing a sacred ceremony, she wiped the boy's legs with an alcohol-soaked cotton ball. Her hands, accustomed to the weight of buckets and the harshness of cleaning products, moved with the precision of a surgeon. Her fingers glided over the pale skin, searching not for muscles or bones, but for the meridians, the invisible rivers of energy that, according to her ancestors, sustained life. She could feel them, like warm currents beneath the cool surface of the skin. Downstairs, Arthur watched the baby monitor. He had cancelled 3 important meetings about a new venture that promised astronomical dividends. His son's tranquility was, at that moment, the most valuable asset in his vast portfolio. He saw the boy's steady breathing, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm that was, in itself, an unexpected profit. A dangerous optimism, like a weed, began to sprout in his exhausted heart. Could it be possible? Had science, in all its arrogance, been wrong? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. False hope was a poison, an emotional liability he couldn't afford to accumulate. In the room, May held the first needle between her thumb and forefinger. She whispered a silent prayer in her native Mandarin, asking permission from the boy's body and guidance from the spirits of her ancestors. Then, with a quick, precise movement, the needle pierced the skin, sliding into the exact point she had located. Leo didn't even stir. She inserted a second, a third, until a dozen golden points adorned the boy's motionless legs, like stars in a night sky. They were beacons of hope in a sea of resignation, an attempt to reconnect the energy that the disease had severed. She could feel the pulse of life under her fingers, faint but present. A subtle warmth began to emanate from the points where the needles rested, a sign that the QE, the vital energy, was responding. She needed to let them work for a few minutes, just enough time to awaken without overwhelming. Time, however, was her enemy. The sound of firm footsteps on the marble hallway froze her. It was Agnes's stride, unmistakable. May looked in panic at Leo's legs, a garden of golden needles glittering in plain sight. It was too late to remove them. The door was just feet away, and the handle began to turn. The sound of the turning doorknob was like a gunshot in the quiet room. For a split second, May was paralyzed, the air trapped in her lungs, the image of the golden needles shining like a confession embedded in Leo's skin. Losing her job was certain, the humiliation inevitable. But it was the thought of abandoning Leo to his silent resignation that spurred her into action. In a single, fluid, desperate motion, she grabbed the edge of the heavy linen sheet and pulled it up, covering the boy's legs to his waist. The gesture was so quick, so instinctive, it could have been mistaken for a simple act of care, of tucking in a sleeping child. The door opened the very instant the fabric settled, completely concealing her secret. Agnes entered, her gaze as sharp as a hawk's. Her eyes swept from May, kneeling beside the bed, to Leo's sleeping face, and then back to May. "Haven't I told you not to disturb the patient? Your work isn't in here." The nurse's voice was controlled, but laced with a suspicion that poisoned the air. May rose slowly, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. "I'm sorry. Ms. Agnes. I heard a sigh and came to see if he needed anything. He seemed so peaceful today." The calm in May's voice was a mask for the panic churning in her stomach. Agnes didn't look convinced. She approached the bed, her nose wrinkling slightly as she caught a nearly imperceptible scent, a distant echo of spices she couldn't place. To her, any uncontrolled variable was a threat. Arthur Sterling's fortune paid for precision, for science, not for strange smells and meddling housekeepers. His peacefulness is the result of a carefully calculated medical regimen, and it does not require your supervision. Return to your duties. Every word was a command, a reassertion of her dominion over this small universe of pain. May nodded and left, her heart still hammering. She would have to come back later to remove the needles, another risk in a morning already fraught with peril. Later that day, Arthur, feeling an unusual lightness after his son's uninterrupted night of sleep, summoned Agnes to his study. "He seems better today, don't you think? More alert." Agnes maintained her professional posture. "It's a normal fluctuation, Mr. Sterling. We mustn't build false hopes." Then, with calculated skill, she planted the seed of doubt. "However, I am concerned about the new housekeeper. She shows an excessive interest in Leo. I found her giving him a massage yesterday. These are practices with no scientific basis that could interfere with his treatment." Arthur frowned. He was a businessman, a multi-millionaire who built his empire on data and analysis. The idea of baseless practices bothered him. Yet, the only new variable in his equation was May, and the result had been a positive one, an unexpected profit. Logic and intuition waged a silent battle within him. Agnes, sensing her authority needed reinforcing, decided to act more drastically. She found May in the downstairs hallway, polishing the dining room silverware, a collection worth more than May would earn in a lifetime. The nurse stood before her, an imposing figure in her crisp white uniform. "There has been a change in hygiene protocols," she said, her voice as cold as the polished metal. "From now on, your responsibilities are restricted to this floor. The bedroom wing, especially Master Leo's room, is strictly off-limits. Only authorized medical personnel may enter. Am I clear?" The words fell on May like the bars of a cell. She was being banished, exiled from the boy. She looked at her own hands, which minutes before had tried to weave a miracle, and realized the distance between her and Leo was no longer just a few stairs. It was an unbridgeable chasm, guarded by a dragon in white. The days following the ban were a silent form of torture for May. Confined to the ground floor, she moved like a ghost among the cold opulence of the great rooms, the gleam of the vast marble floors, the crystal chandelier that cascaded like a frozen waterfall in the foyer, the rare wood furniture, all of it seemed to mock her. Every object she cleaned, every surface she polished, was a reminder of her distance from Leo. Her hands ached to continue the work they had started, but they were bound to mundane tasks, while upstairs, the vital energy she had tried to awaken was surely receding, returning to its slumber. She listened to the sounds of the house with a painful focus. Agnes's brisk footsteps, the soft roll of the medicine cart, and most excruciating of all, the silence that meant Leo was once again confined to his bed, without the promise of a touch that might ease his prison. The brief period of peace Leo had experienced vanished like a dawn dream. The nightly spasms returned, crueler and more persistent than before, as if the disease were taking revenge for that small defiance. Arthur, from his vigil in front of the baby monitor, felt the hope that had sprouted in his chest ripped out by the roots. That oasis of tranquility had been just a mirage in the desert of his despair. He looked at his business reports, at the charts showing his net worth grow in dollars, at the rising price of gold, and felt a profound disgust. What good was being a multi-millionaire, having a cash flow that would be the envy of small nations, if he couldn't buy a single healthy neuron for his son? Capital, his god, was powerless. Agnes, for her part, felt a grim professional satisfaction. She recorded the return of the symptoms in her reports with meticulous precision. "As I predicted, Mr. Sterling," she told him one morning, her tone a mixture of false compassion and self-vindication. "His condition has a cyclical pattern. The improvement a few days ago was merely a statistical anomaly. It is crucial that we stick to the scientific treatment without outside interference." The word interference hung in the air, a veiled accusation that Arthur, in his grief, had no strength to challenge. May could no longer bear the helplessness. She needed to find a breach in the fortress Agnes had built around Leo. She began to observe the household routines with the focus of a strategist. Agnes controlled the medicine, the hygiene, the physical therapy. But there was one thing that came from outside her direct domain. The food. Maria, the cook, was a stout, soft-hearted woman who had been with the family since before Leo was born. She saw the family's pain with a mother's eyes and always tried to please the boy with his favorite dishes, even if he barely touched them. May saw her only chance. She approached Maria in the kitchen as the cook was preparing a vegetable puree. With her heart in her throat, she offered a small paper sachet. "Maria," she began, her voice low and hesitant. "My grandmother used to make a tea with these herbs. She said it calms the dreams and strengthens the body. It's not medicine, it's just a comfort. Could you mix a tiny bit into Master Leo's soup?" Maria took the sachet and smelled the gentle aroma of chamomile and valerian root. She looked into May's pleading eyes and saw not the audacity of an insubordinate employee, but the desperation of someone who wanted to help. She thought of the head nurse, of her rigid rules. But then she looked at the bland soup destined for Leo and made a decision. "Leave it with me, my dear. A little bit of comfort never hurt anyone." Minutes later, the tray with Leo's soup, now carrying a secret hope, was placed in the small service elevator that would take it directly upstairs. May watched the metal doors close, holding her breath, knowing that her message of healing was now on its way into the heart of enemy territory. The soup, infused with May's silent hope, worked its subtle magic. That night, Leo's spasms didn't vanish completely, but they were noticeably gentler, less violent. In the morning, Arthur, who had spent the night in a tense vigil before the monitor, noticed something else. There was a new clarity in his son's eyes. When he entered the room to say good morning, Leo turned his head toward him, and for a fleeting instant, the sketch of a smile touched his lips. It was a minuscule movement, almost imperceptible, but to Arthur, it was like witnessing a sunrise after a decade of darkness. That glimmer of joy was a more precious dividend than all the profits from his financial portfolio combined. He felt a wave of emotion so strong he had to sit down. Twice. 2 anomalies in a single week. A man who had built his fortune analyzing market patterns and trends could no longer ignore the data. Science had presented him with an unchanging, downward-sloping graph, but now 2 unexpected points had appeared, defying the projection. The cause was unknown, but the effect was undeniable. Agnes also noted the improvement. On her clipboard she wrote, "Reduction in frequency and intensity of spasms, patient more responsive to external stimuli." To Arthur, she maintained the same professional caution. "The body sometimes has these small rallies, Mr. Sterling. It's important to remain objective." But inside, Agnes's certainty was beginning to be eroded by curiosity. Her system was perfect, sealed. How could something or someone be influencing it? Her eyes became more watchful, her suspicion a shadow that stretched across the entire house. She began observing Maria in the kitchen, subtly questioning the delivery men, searching for any variable that might have slipped her control. Downstairs, a knowing glance between May and Maria was all the confirmation they needed. Their small rebellion had worked. May felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of relief and urgency. The herbs were a palliative, a whisper to Leo's body, but to truly reawaken the dormant rivers of energy, she needed the needles. Agnes's ban, however, was an iron wall. How could she ever reach him? The thought of giving up was unbearable. She had proven to herself that she could make a difference. To retreat now would be like abandoning a drowning man after throwing him a rope. That day, in his office overlooking the pulsating city, Arthur couldn't concentrate. Discussions about acquiring a new tech firm, analysis of the volatile crypto market, plans to increase his already billion-dollar net worth. It all seemed trivial, distant. The image that dominated his thoughts was the ghost of a smile on his son's face. He felt like a man dying of thirst while floating on an ocean of salt water. He possessed all the world's resources, an inheritance of power and money for Leo that grew by the second. But he was unable to give him the most fundamental asset, his health. On impulse, he made a decision that shocked his team. In the middle of the afternoon, at the height of the stock market's trading day, he stood up. "Cancel the rest of the day," he told his assistant, his voice firm with a resolution that brooked no argument. "I'm going home." He didn't want to wait until evening to see his son. He wanted to be there now, to witness, to absorb every small sign of improvement, however ephemeral it might be. As his driver navigated the bustling streets, Arthur felt an agitation that wasn't purely joy. It was a strange anxiety, a premonition that something was about to happen. He didn't know why, but he felt that by arriving home early, he wouldn't just find the usual routine. He felt he was speeding toward a revelation, a moment that could either cement his newfound hope or shatter it forever. Arthur's car slid silently through the imposing gates of his estate. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns, an oasis of perfection that contrasted with the turmoil in his heart. The house, normally a sanctuary of silence and order, greeted him with a stillness that, on this day, felt strange, almost ominous. He let himself in through a side door, a habit he kept to avoid the formality of the main entrance. The absence of sound was total. Maria must have been on her break, and Agnes, he assumed, would be in her small office on the second floor, updating her records. It was the perfect time to go up and surprise Leo, perhaps read him a story, or just sit beside him, absorbing his son's comforting presence. As he took the first steps up the grand staircase, a sound stopped him. It was faint, almost inaudible, coming from Leo's room. It wasn't the sound of a moan or a spasm. It was different. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, almost a melodic whisper. Curious, he continued upward, but more cautiously now, his expensive shoes muffled by the Persian runner. His heart began to pound, a mix of curiosity and a primal fear every parent carries. What could it be? Had Agnes started some new sound therapy without consulting him? The door to Leo's room was ajar. The sound was clearer now, a kind of low, lilting chant in a language he didn't recognize. Fear gave way to a cold panic that shot up his spine. He forgot all caution. He shoved the door open and rushed inside, his heart in his throat, his mind flooded with the worst images a father can conjure. And then he froze. The scene before him was so shocking, so contrary to everything he knew, that his brain refused to process it for an instant. May, the housekeeper, was kneeling on the floor next to Leo, who had been carefully laid on a soft rug. The woman was focused, her head bowed, and it was from her lips that the soft, ancient melody came, and embedded in his son's motionless legs, glinting in the light from the window, were dozens of thin, golden needles. The air rushed out of Arthur's lungs. The sight hit him with the force of a physical blow. Needles. In his defenseless son, the word that exploded in his mind was torture. He saw the woman, the silent immigrant, not as a caregiver, but as a madwoman, a sadist performing some bizarre, sick ritual. Leo's improvement, the smile, the peaceful night, Had it all been a sham, a prelude to this unimaginable act of cruelty? His strength left him, his knees buckled and he fell, the impact muffled by the thick rug. A scream of horror and rage was caught in his throat, a knot of pure agony. He opened his mouth to shout for Agnes, for the police, for help, but no sound came out. His eyes, wide with panic, were fixed on his son's legs, waiting to see blood, waiting to see the pain on Leo's face. He braced himself for the worst, for the confirmation that he had allowed a monster into his house to hurt the only thing he loved in the world. But then, in the midst of his paralyzing terror, he saw it, the little toe on Leo's right foot. It moved, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch. Arthur blinked, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. He looked again, holding his breath, and the toe moved again, a voluntary motion, a deliberate contraction like a long, dormant flower trying to bloom. It wasn't a spasm of pain, it was a response. This wasn't torture. It was something else, something he didn't understand, but which in that instant shattered his panic and replaced it with an astonishment so profound, so overwhelming, that it left him breathless. Arthur Sterling's world reconfigured in that instant. The sound of his own heart was the only noise in his universe, each beat marking time in a new era. The panic that had felled him receded, replaced by a stunned awe. Leo's toe, it had moved. It wasn't a hallucination born of desperation. It was real. The infinitesimal movement held more power and promise than all the assets in his billion-dollar portfolio. May, startled by Arthur's abrupt entrance and collapse, froze for a second, her hands hovering over Leo's legs, fear plain on her face. She had expected the shouting, the accusation, the fury of a father seeing her as a threat. Instead, she met his wide eyes, filled not with anger, but with a disbelief that bordered on reverence. Slowly, Arthur got to his feet. His legs were shaking, not from weakness, but from the adrenaline of a hope he hadn't felt in years, a hope so potent it was almost painful. He looked from May to Leo, and back to May. His mind, trained to analyze data, to find patterns in the chaos of financial markets, struggled to process the input. Science had said impossible, logic had said terminal, but his own eyes were telling him something else. "What?" he began, his voice a raw whisper that barely made it past the knot in his throat. "What did you do?" The question was not an accusation. It was a plea, a request for an explanation of the miracle he had just witnessed. Seeing the vulnerability on his face, May's fear turned to compassion. She understood that this man, a titan of the business world, was, in that moment, just a desperate father clinging to a thread of light in the darkness. "It's acupuncture," she said softly, her voice bringing an unexpected calm to the tense room. "An ancient art. The body has its own rivers of energy, the QI. Your son's illness, it has created blockages, dams in these rivers. The energy cannot flow. The needles, they are not to cause pain. They are to call the energy back, to show it the way, to break the dams and let life flow again." Arthur listened, each word resonating in a deep place inside him that logic couldn't reach. He looked at the golden needles, no longer as instruments of torture, but as keys, unlocking doors that modern medicine didn't even know existed. "But how? Who are you?" The question was about everything. How did a housekeeper, a woman who dusted his priceless possessions, possess such knowledge? It was then that May told him her story. Her voice was quiet, but weighted with generations. She spoke of her family in China, of a line of healers who passed their secrets from master to apprentice. She told him of her grandmother, a wise woman whose hands could read a person's body like a book. She revealed that she was a master herself, that she had studied for decades, that her degree and reputation in her homeland were as solid as gold. But here, in this new country, her knowledge was worth nothing. It was seen as folklore. Her diploma, a worthless piece of paper. Housekeeping had been the only door that opened, a way to survive, to maintain her dignity. As Arthur listened, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place with stunning clarity. The massage, the peaceful night's sleep, the herbs in the soup, the anomalies Agnes had dismissed. They weren't random chance, they were deliberate interventions, courageous acts from a woman who had risked everything. A wave of shame washed over him. He, with all his capital and power, had been blind. The true wealth in this house was not in his vaults or bank accounts. It was here, kneeling on the floor, with hands that knew the secrets of life. In the midst of this revelation, as Arthur and May were suspended in a fragile moment of understanding, a familiar sound echoed in the hall. Firm, efficient, unmistakable footsteps. Agnes. She was returning from her break, punctual as ever. The nurse was about to walk in and find the scene. The stunned employer, the forbidden housekeeper, and the dozens of golden needles testifying to an act of rebellion she could never comprehend or forgive. The sound of Agnes's footsteps in the hall was the ticking of a time bomb. For a moment, the old Arthur, the businessman who assessed risk and mitigated loss, screamed inside him to get up, to join the accusation, to restore order. It would be the logical move, the safe decision. But the new Arthur, the father who had just witnessed the resurrection of a single, tiny muscle, won the battle. In a move that surprised even himself, he shifted his position. Not to attack May, but to subtly place himself between her and the door that was about to open. It was an instinctive act of protection, an investment of faith made in a split second. The door swung open and Agnes entered, clipboard in hand, a look of brisk efficiency on her face. The look dissolved instantly, replaced by a mute shock that quickly curdled into an icy fury. Her eyes darted from Arthur, on his knees on the floor, to May, still near Leo, and then landed on the golden needles. For her, it was the final proof, the crime scene that confirmed all her suspicions. What is the meaning of this? Her voice was low, but vibrated with restrained outrage. I forbade you from entering this room. This is an outrage. A violation of all safety protocols. Mr. Sterling, this woman is endangering your son. She prepared to march toward Leo, to rip the needles out, to physically eject May from the room. But Arthur's voice stopped her, calm and solid as bedrock. Agnes. He rose slowly, brushing invisible dust from his knees. I'm here. I allowed it. The lie came out with the ease of truth. A verbal barricade to protect the woman he had believed to be a madwoman only minutes before. Agnes stared at him, confusion warring with anger on her face. Allowed it, sir, with all due respect. You are not a doctor. This is dangerous quackery, the risk of infection, of nerve damage. His toe moved, Agnes. Arthur's words cut through her speech. My son's toe, I saw it with my own eyes. The nurse shook her head, a pitying, disbelieving smile on her lips. Mr. Sterling, you're emotionally compromised. It could have been a spasm, a reflex. It was not a spasm, Arthur insisted, the conviction in his voice solidifying with every word. I know every spasm, every tremor of my son's body. This was different. This was life. During the tense exchange, May, with a serenity that seemed to come from another world, began removing the needles one by one, with delicate, precise movements, swabbing each point with a cotton ball. There was no blood, no marks, just the boy's pale skin. Arthur's mind, the multimillionaire's mind, made a quick calculation. On one side, Agnes, representing science, predictability, safety, a low-risk asset, but with no profitability, no growth. On the other, May, the unknown, the inexplicable, a high-risk investment that had just paid him his first dividend of hope in years. And, as in any successful business, sometimes you have to cut your liabilities to make room for assets with higher growth potential. He made his decision. Agnes, he said, his tone now leaving no room for argument, your work is done for today. You can go home. We'll discuss this tomorrow." The nurse's jaw dropped. To be dismissed, sent home like a scolded child, was a blow to her professional pride she could not stomach. "Mr. Sterling, I must warn you," she began. "The decision is made." He cut her off, his voice cold as steel. Agnes glared at him, then shot a look of pure contempt at May. She turned on her heel and stalked out, her footsteps in the hall echoing her defeated fury. The silence that settled in the room was thick and heavy. The immediate threat was gone. But now they were alone in new, uncharted territory. Arthur looked at the woman who until yesterday had polished his flaws and realized, with a mixture of terror and hope, that he had just fired science and placed his son's entire future, his entire fortune of love, in her delicate hands. When Agnes's footsteps faded, the silence left in the room was not one of peace, but of expectation. It vibrated with the weight of the unsaid, with the enormity of the decision just made. Arthur looked at May, and for the first time he saw not the invisible employee, but a woman of a strength and wisdom that humbled him. He, the billionaire accustomed to command, to dictating terms, felt like a novice before a knowledge his money could not buy, nor his logic decipher. The net worth he had spent a lifetime accumulating seemed, in that moment, like a pile of colored paper before the pure gold of her wisdom. He approached Leo, who had fallen asleep again, his face serene, and touched his hair. Fear and hope waged war in his chest. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, his voice low, not to May but to himself. "I'm running on instinct, not logic, in my world that leads to bankruptcy." May finished putting her needles away in their silk case and stood. "In my world," she replied simply. "Instinct is the wisest counselor. It is the voice of the heart. And the heart understands the energy of life better than any machine." Arthur finally faced her directly. "I want you to continue," he said, the words coming out with an urgency that surprised him. "I want you to treat my son, not as a housekeeper in secret, but as the healer you are. I will pay you whatever you ask, any amount, name a number, and it's yours." May smiled, a gentle smile that held no triumph, only understanding. "Mr. Sterling, you still think in the language of money. Healing does not have a price. What I do, it cannot be bought, but it can be accepted. If you give me your trust, if you allow me to work in harmony with your son, that will be the only payment I require." Her answer disarmed him completely. He, who lived in a transactional world where every service had a cost and every investment demanded a return, was faced with an act of pure altruism. He nodded, feeling small. "You have my trust, total and unconditional. What do you need? What should I do?" "I need freedom," May said. "Freedom to come to this room when I feel Leo's energy is receptive. I need some ingredients for his teas and oils, things not found in common markets. And most of all, I need patience, yours and his. This is not like closing a deal. It is like tending a garden. It takes time for the seeds to sprout." At that moment, Leo stirred on the bed and his eyes opened. He looked not at his father, but directly at May. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet recognition, an acceptance. He lifted his hand, a slow, effortful gesture, and reached out toward her. May moved closer and took his small hand in hers. "I am here," she whispered. "Everything is going to be all right." Arthur watched the scene, his heart overflowing with an emotion so pure it seemed to burn. It was a profit that couldn't be measured, a dividend of pure love. The alliance was sealed, a new path, uncertain and frightening, opened before him. He felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Resignation had been replaced by action, passivity by hope. Just then, the phone in his pocket buzzed, shrill in the quiet room. He glanced at the caller ID and his blood ran cold. It was the private number for Dr. Evans, the head of neurology at the most prestigious hospital in the country, the doctor who had delivered the final verdict on Leo. Agnes had not gone home quietly. She had gone to war. The phone's vibration was a brutal intrusion into the sanctuary the room had become. The name Dr. Evans, glowing on the screen, was a reminder of the world Arthur had just defied. The world of established science, of rules, of irrefutable diagnoses. He knew with a cold certainty what this call meant. Agnes had wasted no time. She had escalated the situation, appealing to the highest authority to validate her position and report what she had surely described as an act of dangerous negligence. Arthur's heart sank. It was one thing to defy a nurse. It was another thing entirely to face the pantheon of modern medicine. For an instant, doubt assailed him. Was he being a fool, a desperate father grasping at fantasies, putting his son at even greater risk? He looked at Leo's hand, still holding May's, and the doubt dissolved. His reality was right there, in that touch, in that connection. He answered the call, his hand steady. "Arthur." Dr. Evans's voice was grave, weighted with an authority accustomed to being unquestioned. "I've received a very disturbing call from your nurse, Agnes. She described a situation. Frankly, it's unbelievable. I need you to tell me what she reported isn't true." Arthur took a deep breath. The temptation to back down, to apologize, to say it was all a misunderstanding was immense. It would be the easy path, the one that avoided confrontation and judgment, but it would also be a betrayal of the spark of hope that had just been kindled. "Dr. Evans," he began, his voice calm but carrying a new, unshakable weight. "What Agnes told you about the needles is true. And there's something else she didn't tell you, because she didn't see it. I saw my son move his toe today. Voluntarily." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Arthur could almost hear the doctor's skepticism, the disapproval solidifying. "Arthur," Evans's voice returned, now tinged with condescension, as if speaking to a child. "You are under unimaginable stress. It's natural for the mind, under such circumstances, to see what it wants to see. A muscle reflex, a spasm." "It wasn't a reflex, doctor. I was there." Arthur's firmness surprised even himself. He wasn't asking for permission or absolution. He was stating a fact. "With all due respect for your work and expertise, which have been invaluable to me, something happened here today that your textbooks don't explain, and I'm not going to ignore it." The silence on the other end was longer this time. When Dr. Evans spoke again, his tone had shifted. The condescension had given way to a professional chill. "Arthur, I need to be very clear. The treatment you are allowing has no scientific basis. It is dangerous. You are interfering with protocol and, more importantly, you are opening the door to false hopes that will only lead to greater suffering. As Leo's physician and as your friend, I urge you to stop this immediately. If you don't, I'm afraid I cannot continue as his doctor of record. I cannot attach my name to practices of this nature." The threat was clear, an ultimatum. Either he returned to the fold of orthodox science, or he was on his own. For a man like Arthur Sterling, whose entire life was built on expert validation and the security of proven investments, this was the abyss. Losing Dr. Evans's backing meant burning the bridge to Western medicine. He looked at May. She was watching him, her deep eyes showing not fear, but a quiet expectation. She wasn't telling him what to do. She was trusting him to make the right choice. And in that choice lay everything. He thought of his business empire, of how sometimes the greatest return came from the greatest risk, from investing in a new, disruptive idea that everyone else called madness. He was about to make the biggest investment of his life, not with his capital, but with his faith. "Doctor," Arthur said, the decision echoing in every syllable, "I understand your position, and I'm sorry it has come to this, but I also saw what I saw, and I cannot, in good conscience, close this door. Therefore, if you cannot continue with us under these new circumstances, I accept your decision." He ended the call. The final click was the sound of a bridge being burned. He was alone now, navigating uncharted waters with only a silent healer as his compass. The feeling was not one of panic, but of a terrifying freedom. He turned to May, a new glint in his eye. "It looks like it's just us now." But before she could answer, he had an idea, a spark of inspiration so audacious, so unthinkable, it could change everything. "No," he said, excitement growing in his voice. "It won't be just us. Get your needles. We're going to them." Arthur's idea was a lightning bolt from a clear sky, a high-stakes maneuver that defied all logic and prudence. It was the kind of bold move that, in the business world, could either ruin a multimillionaire or consecrate him as a genius. May looked at him, the surprise in her eyes quickly replaced by a deep understanding. She saw that he wasn't just fighting back, he was changing the rules of the game. He would no longer wait for the world to come to him, he would bring his new world to them. The drive to the hospital was surreal. Leo, settled carefully in his specialized wheelchair in the adapted vehicle, watched the city pass by with a quiet curiosity. May sat beside him, her presence an island of calm in the impending storm. Arthur, in the front seat, was constantly on the phone, not with his stockbrokers, but with his lawyer, the head of PR for his corporations, the hospital administrator. He wasn't asking for permission, he was informing. He moved with the force of a hurricane, using his immense power and influence not to generate profit, but to open a single door. Their arrival at the hospital was like that of a royal motorcade. Arthur, imposing in his expensive suit, pushed Leo's wheelchair himself while May walked beside him, a serene and enigmatic figure in her simple clothes, clutching her silk bag as if it were a crown jewel. Doctors and nurses stopped in the hallways, whispering, staring with a mixture of awe and disapproval. The news of Agnes's dismissal and the confrontation with Dr. Evans had already spread like wildfire. Dr. Evans was waiting for them at the entrance to a conference room, his expression grim, flanked by two other physicians Arthur didn't recognize. It was a tribunal. "Arthur, this is madness," Evans said, his voice low and tense. "You can't just bring an uncredentialed person into a hospital environment and expect to—" "She isn't here for a tour, Doctor," Arthur cut him off, his voice resonating with an authority that froze everyone. "She is here for a meeting, and my son is here as the only item on the agenda. This hospital was built with a sizable donation from my net worth. The neurology wing is named after my late wife. For one day, for 1 hour, I am not asking, I am demanding that you listen to me." The mention of his financial power was raw, but effective. The doors to the conference room opened. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and sterile. Arthur positioned Leo at one side of the long table and sat beside him. May stood slightly behind the boy. On the other side, the 3 doctors, representing centuries of Western medical knowledge, sat like judges. Dr. Evans began, presenting charts, scans, the relentless progression of the disease. He spoke of neurons, of myelin, of failed experimental treatments. It was a logical, irrefutable presentation, a scientific demonstration of hopelessness. Arthur listened patiently. When Evans finished, he didn't counter with theories. He simply said, "Now I would like for Master May to speak." All eyes turned to May. She took a step forward, her calm a stark contrast to the tension in the room. She didn't speak of ki or meridians. She looked at the doctors and said, in her soft voice, "Your science sees the body as a machine with broken parts. Mine sees the body as a garden where the water has stopped flowing. The parts are not broken. The path is just blocked." Dr. Evans snorted, a sound of derision. "That's poetry, not medicine. Where is your data, your double-blind studies, your proof?" Arthur leaned forward. "The proof is right here." He gestured to Leo. "I saw it. I know what I saw." "A father's wishful thinking," one of the other doctors retorted. The tension peaked. The confrontation was total. Faith against reason, observation against statistics. It seemed it would end there, in a bitter stalemate. It was then that Arthur made his final play, the biggest investment of his life. "Very well," he said, standing up. "If you believe in proof, then I propose a test. Here, now. Let May do what she does. You watch. Use your machines, your sensors, whatever you want. If nothing happens, I will walk away. I will rehire Agnes. I will apologize for this scene. And I will donate another $10 million to your research fund as a penance for wasting your time." The wager silenced the room. Dr. Evans looked at Arthur, at the silent woman, and at the boy in the wheelchair. Professional arrogance warred with a spark of scientific curiosity. It was a proposal that, however absurd, he couldn't refuse without looking dogmatic and fearful. Slowly, he turned to May. Skepticism etched into every line of his face. "Show me." Arthur's challenge hung in the cold air of skepticism. Dr. Evans's words, "show me," were not a concession, but a trap. He expected failure, the final proof that Arthur was a deluded father and May a charlatan. The conference room transformed into a stage, with science as the judge and jury. One of the younger doctors, grudgingly and on Evans's orders, brought in an electromyography machine, a device that measures the electrical activity of muscles. Small sensors were attached to Leo's inert legs, wires connecting his still body to a monitor that would display any neural contraction, however small. For them, it was a way to debunk the sham with objective data. For Arthur, it was the chance to prove his investment of faith would yield an incalculable return. May was unfazed by the technology. She knelt, ignoring the wires and monitors as if they were mere vines in her garden. She opened her silk case, and the soft glint of the golden needles seemed to warm the sterile room. With a focus that silenced even the doctor's murmurs, she began her work. Her hands did not tremble. Each needle was inserted with a precision born of a deep knowledge, not of books, but of touch, of energy. She did not look at the monitor, but at Leo's face, reading the subtle signs only she seemed to understand. The minutes dragged on like hours. On the monitor, the line representing Leo's muscle activity remained flat, a straight, unwavering line, the electronic hum of a body in silence. Arthur felt a cold sweat on his neck. The confidence he had felt began to erode against the cold reality of that unforgiving green line. Dr. Evans crossed his arms, a faint "I told you so" smile forming on his lips. He was about to declare an end to the circus. But then something happened. The line on the monitor trembled. A tiny, almost insignificant peak, an electronic hiccup. The younger doctor leaned in, frowning. "Probably interference," he muttered. But May, who wasn't looking at the machine, felt it. She closed her eyes and gently twisted one of the needles at a specific point on Leo's ankle. And then the miracle repeated itself, but this time it was undeniable. It wasn't just a toe. The muscle in Leo's calf contracted visibly under the pale skin. On the monitor, the flat line exploded into a series of sharp peaks, the machine's beeps responding to the sudden neural activity. It was the symphony of life returning. The room fell into absolute silence. Dr. Evans's derisive smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure astonishment. He looked from Leo's leg to the monitor and back to the leg, as if he couldn't believe the evidence of his own eyes and his own technology. It was not interference. It was not a random spasm. It was a direct, controlled response to a stimulation his science could not comprehend. A wave of relief, so powerful, washed over Arthur that he felt his knees go weak again, this time not from panic, but from an overwhelming gratitude. He had gambled everything, and the return was the greatest wealth he could ever conceive. Dr. Evans stood, walked to the table, and stared at the screen, then at the needles. For the first time, he saw not quackery, but a phenomenon he could not explain. He turned to May, the pride and arrogance drained from his face, leaving behind a genuinely intrigued and humbled scientist. "I don't understand," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper, "but I saw it." He then looked at Arthur, and then at his team. "What happened here today cannot be ignored." He paused, and the words he spoke next sealed the end of the conflict and the beginning of an unimaginable future. "Master May, I would like to propose an alliance. I want the hospital's advanced physical therapy to work in conjunction with your sessions. I want to study, document, and learn. For the first time, Eastern and Western medicine do not have to be rivals. For Leo's sake, they can become allies." The unlikely alliance, forged in the fire of confrontation and sealed by the irrefutable evidence of a twitching muscle, transformed the silent mansion into a vibrant center of hope. The months that followed were a tapestry woven from the threads of two distinct wisdoms. Mornings were filled with the cutting-edge equipment of Western physical therapy, with therapists guiding Leo's legs in passive motions, stimulating muscle memory. The afternoons, however, belonged to May. They were hours of silence, of the sense of ginger and cinnamon, and of the soft glint of golden needles awakening the dormant rivers of energy. Arthur watched it all, no longer a desperate spectator, but an active participant. He learned the language of both worlds. He would discuss gains in range of motion with the physical therapists, and minutes later, listen to May speak of the flow of qi and the body's balance. The fortune he once poured into volatile stock market investments was now channeled into creating the perfect synergy between the two treatments, funding research and equipment that could complement May's ancient art. Progress was slow, measured in millimeters, not miles. The first voluntary twitch of a toe gave way to the tremble of an ankle. Weeks later, Leo managed to bend his knee, a feat that made Arthur weep with joy. Each small victory was celebrated like the greatest profit of his career. He discovered that true returns weren't in the compounding interest of his capital, but in the growing light in his son's eyes. 6 months after the hospital meeting, Arthur was in his home office, reviewing some business documents that no longer held his attention as they once did. The constant hum of the financial market seemed like a distant, unimportant noise. That's when he heard it, a sound from the hallway. It wasn't the smooth roll of the wheelchair or the brisk step of a nurse. It was a new sound, hesitant, a shuffle, followed by a metallic click. Shuffle, click, shuffle, click. His heart stopped. He dropped the papers and rushed to his office door, the fear of imagining things warring with a wild hope. He threw the door open and saw him, Leo, standing, on his own. He was clutching a metal walker, his face a mask of Herculean effort. He would take a step, dragging his leg, then plant the walker, making the metallic click, and he was coming toward him. Beside him, walking without touching him, but ready to catch him at any moment, was May. Her face held not a triumphant smile, but a radiant serenity, the quiet joy of a gardener watching her most precious flower finally bloom. Arthur didn't collapse in pain, as he had that afternoon that felt like a lifetime ago. He fell to his knees, not from weakness, but because his legs could no longer support the weight of this colossal joy, of this love that overflowed and filled him completely. Tears streamed freely down his face, as Leo, with one last effort, let go of the walker with one hand and reached out to his father. Arthur grabbed that small hand as if it were the anchor to his soul. He looked up, from Leo to May, and in her gaze he saw his entire future. The scene that had shattered him months before, expecting the worst, hadn't been the beginning of a nightmare, but the end of one. He had fallen in love, not with the housekeeper, but with the healer. With the woman whose needles of hope had stitched together his son's future and mended his own broken heart. He stood, pulled May close, and with Leo between them, they formed a circle of love and gratitude. "Stay," he whispered to May, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as an employee, not as a therapist. Stay as the partner who taught me that a cure sometimes lies not in the most advanced science, but in the most ancient wisdom, and that love is the only force capable of making the impossible happen." And in the silence of that house, which was no longer a kingdom of immobility, but an empire of hope, a new kind of wealth, immeasurable and eternal, had finally found its home.